All right, everybody. How are we doing this evening? Tonight, it's a bit of a different stream. Actually, no, it's the exact same kind of stream. What am I talking about? It's been a long couple days, having some car problems and dealing with all that. It's been a little bit stressful, so bear with me. We are going to get started like we usually do. There we go. With Poor Bishop Hooper, we're going to be listening to Psalm 5. So here we go.
Give ear to my words, Lord. Consider my groanings. Give ear to the sound of my cry, O kind King, O God of mine. O Lord, in the morning, you hear my voice. In the morning I wake and you see my dawn sacrifice. Through the abundance of your steadfast love, I'll enter your house, Lord, bow down to all your holy temple in good fear of you. Lead on, O Lord, make your way straight before me. Let all who take refuge in you. Let all who take refuge in you. Let all who take refuge in Let all who take refuge in Let them ever see, let them ever see, let them ever see the joy, 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 joy. Let them ever see, let them ever sing, let them ever sing for joy.
All right. What another wonderful psalm from Poor Bishop Hooper. I highly recommend you check them out. They're a wonderful group, and I enjoy them very, very much. So we are going to move on over. This is a little bit longer video. It's going to be a couple hours long, actually. It's going to be Chuck Missler, and we are going to be learning about what is truth. This is the question that Pilate asks to Jesus in one of his trials. When Jesus replies to one of Pilate's answers, you speak the truth. And I think that, yeah, I think that it's a very important question. He's got some interesting takes on what truth is. Thanks for joining us, Galactic. Nice to have you. Glad that you were talking about Chuck Missler the other day. I love his stuff on Revelation.
What is truth? That was the rhetorical question by Pontius Pilate when he was facing truth itself. And yet that's going to be the basic challenge before us all. How do we really know what's true? We take that so for granted, and yet there are tools and there's a science of understanding truth. How do we know the Bible is true? That's perhaps the most crucial question among us. We're going to approach this in a rather unorthodox manner. We're going to start by talking about the boundaries of our reality. How do you examine them? How do you qualify sources of information? And how do you test hypotheses to find out whether they're true or not? There are standard tools that we need to be aware of to do these things. Well, our challenges before us, of course, first of all, deal with our skeptical environment that we find ourselves in. We have attacks on every side for the very existence of truth. We live in a society that espouses value relativism. You have your truth, I have mine, which is utter nonsense in terms of denying the existence of absolute truth. And this, of course, is accompanied with attacks on the Bible itself, the fountain of truth for mankind, the very basis of our heritage. And, of course, attacks on the Lord himself. Now, this is all in a background of cosmic warfare. We understand from the scripture that we are faced with spiritual adversaries that deal with the principal weapons of deceit and doubt. That was Satan's first move in the Garden of Eden, to ask the question, yea, hath God said? Raising doubts that God really said what he said. And that strategy echoes throughout the centuries and is very, very extant in our civilization today. So how do we know the Bible is true? You know, there are testimonies from the past. There are scholastic evidences, manuscript evidence. We could go through all the different translations and authentications of the manuscripts. We can also deal with the testimony of contemporary eyewitnesses at the time. And this is the traditional approach to dealing with defending the Bible, its veracity, its truthfulness, and so forth. We're not going to spend much time on that because that tends to be scholastic, tends to be academic, tends to be a little distant from where you and I really live. And so we're going to focus more intensely on testimonies from the present. We're going to explore the very boundaries of what we think of as reality itself before we go any further. We're going to talk a little bit about the lessons of modern science. It's really quite astonishing to realize how the discoveries of modern science of just the last century or so have totally altered our understanding of the reality that we live in. We're going to talk, strangely enough, about messages from outside the boundaries of our reality. Messages that actually have their origin that are extraterrestrial, outside the space-time you and I inhabit. And we'll talk also about some hidden discoveries in the biblical text itself that may surprise you. It's this last area that we're going to focus on most intensely. But we're doing all this in the advent of a very popular book, The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. Very readable novel, very cleverly crafted. And yet, although it masquerades as a novel, it confronts the reader with a fact sheet up front with 3 paragraphs claiming that these things in the paragraphs are true and accurate when they're not. They're deliberate deceptions and not accidental misunderstandings, a deliberate attempt to deceive and confuse and disrupt the faithful. That book, of course, has given rise to a whole cottage industry of rebuttals, books that attack the various premises and misinformation that pervades Dan Brown's colorful but blasphemous novel. And Dan Brown, The Da Vinci Code, heralded by the press as a compelling blend of history and page-turning suspense, a masterpiece that should be mandatory reading, says the Library Journal. An exhaustively researched page-turner by Publishers Weekly. Astonishing, because it's full of misinformation and twists of history. And, to make matters even worse, is the subject of a major blockbuster movie by Ron Howard by the same name. So it is very much launching a tsunami of sorts across our culture, raising questions, certainly feeding the skeptical and confusing the marginally faithful, and should be challenging those of us that take the Bible seriously to really understand its origins and its foundation. While all this is going on, the National Geographic wants to get into the exploitation here. In their May issue of 2006, they have a feature article on the Judas Gospel, and obviously exploiting, as the best they can, the groundswell from the Da Vinci movie, which is being released that same month. The National Geographic has a very slick presentation, very skillfully designed to undermine traditional biblical beliefs. And the Gospel of Judas, which is the subject, was discovered back in the 70s. It was known and refuted by Irenaeus back in 180 AD. It's not new news, and it's certainly not historical, but it's among those documents that are used by people who don't really know their Bible to confuse. Mel Gibson did a movie called The Passion. His reviews were a little different than Dan Brown's. The New Republic said a repulsive, masochistic fantasy, a sacred snuff film, they called it. Courting bigotry in the name of sanctity, according to the New York Times. A real nutcase whose ulterior motive was making money, according to 60 Minutes. You know something strange going on here? Why is the Passion excoriated and the Da Vinci Code extolled? Why are Gibson's motives denounced and Brown's dignified? You see something upside down here? Why is Christ's passion regarded as a repulsive masochistic fantasy, and the supposed marriage between Mary Magdalene touted as researched material fact? Nothing could be further from the truth. So these are attacks, of course, from the pagan left, very organized, very sinister, and possibly very much motivated supernaturally. Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, of course, is one of these things. The National Geographic, following right on its tail, is another we're witnessing. The Jesus Seminar, an astonishing array of pseudo-experts who exchange subjective, speculative hunches, replacing serious scholarship. Peter Jennings' TV special. You never find out the real motives behind that. The History Channel, the banned books of the Bible. Hugh Schoenfield, many years ago, back in '66, the Passover plot, that this was all some kind of scheme. And The Last Temptation of Christ in 1960, and on it goes. Even Mel Gibson's phenomenal movie fails to communicate just who Jesus Christ really is. And that is the crux of the whole issue in the first place. So what's going on here? Political correctness in an increasingly secular culture, or even something more? Fiction is promoted as fact, and fact, even the deity of Jesus Christ, is passed off capriciously as mere fiction. Even the undeniable grandeur of the creation itself is attributed to the randomness of a cosmic accident in our schools and in our culture. How astonishing, how distant this is from any real grasp of reality. Well, the traditional defenses of scholarship, of course, by pastors and others, would get into the manuscript evidence, talk about the incredible implications of the Dead Sea Scrolls. We could talk about advanced documentary technologies, the scanning laser microscope and such things that have brought earlier dating to the most important manuscripts, dated contemporaneously with the events they record, and the fact that we have contemporary eyewitnesses in which none of them, not one of them, recanted, even though they suffered torturous deaths. Very, very compelling evidences, but we're not going to focus on that traditional approach. We're going to go a little different way. By the way, advanced technology was to the rescue. A scanning laser microscope can differentiate between 20 micrometers of the papyrus, measuring the height and depth of ink, as well as the angle of the stylus used by the scribe. They can even tell whether he's right or left-handed and so forth. They've learned a lot in recent years, and Karsten Thede, using the Magdalen Greek papyrus from Oxford College, was able to date it essentially contemporaneous with Matthew, and it corresponds with Textus Receptus for those that are interested in that sort of thing. But we're not going to go down that path. The key fact here, of course, is that it was dated much earlier than some of the skeptics have said in the past. But we're also going to hear a great deal about the Gnostic Gospels. Not even the most radical scholar seriously believes that the Gospel of Thomas, for example, was written by the Thomas of the New Testament, or that the Gospel of Philip was written by the Philip of the New Testament, and so forth. These are apocrypha, all under false pseudonyms. They were attributed to the apostles to give their speculations legitimacy. They're not Gospels, by the way. They don't have any historically verifiable facts. They're just opinions, speculative opinions. The early church rejected any documents that were written under pseudonyms because they felt it was inconsistent with the concept of divine inspiration of the New Testament. And all these Gospels, Gnostic Gospels, were written centuries after the Gospel period, typically in the 3rd and 4th century. And they contrast with the eyewitness accounts that we find in the New Testament. And they make no real pretense of being an actual record of events. They're really just speculations of various kinds. And they're anti-historical rather than simply non-historical. But these so-called Gnostic Gospels, the Gnostics, of course, believed that salvation came through hidden knowledge that they had. And there's a whole collection of these that were found in Nag Hammadi, a village in Egypt. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Truth, and about 4 dozen others of these. Sort of reminds you of Matthew 13, where we find Jesus describing these birds that pick up the seed of those that were not grounded properly. When anyone heareth the word of the kingdom and understandeth it not, then cometh the wicked one, as typified by the birds in the parable, and catcheth away that which was sown in his heart. The parables of Matthew 13 highlight the very thing we're witnessing here. Paul warns Timothy, his protege. He says, "For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lust shall heap to themselves teachers having itching ears, and they shall turn away their ears from the truth and be turned unto fables."
Wow, it's incredible the way that Chuck Missler is pretty topical here. You know, you were just talking about having problems finding a church that teaches the truth. And doesn't allow sin into their congregations. And here's, Chuck bringing up that passage that talks about the teachers, going away from sound doctrine. And it's just, it's a tough time. And well, in some ways it's a tough time. In some ways it's a good time. At least it's very clear these days what are and are not good churches, right? Especially with COVID and the way that churches have handled that, it makes it pretty easy to figure out which ones are the good ones and which ones aren't. But it's tough. It's tough, for sure.
And that's exactly what we're watching happen in our culture. So why are these things accepted? Certainly not due to any serious historical research. There's not one single verifiable fact in any of these. A fable, simply, that some have chosen to embrace. Napoleon was famous for saying, "What is history but a fable agreed upon?" And a pretty cynical outlook. The spirit of our times. Doctrinal diversity is the order of the day. Pressure of feminism. The quest for a do-it-yourself religion. A religion that's popular rather than necessarily true. So what we're going to do as we approach this topic, I'm going to call, for lack of a better term, Epistemology 101. We're going to get right at the basics of this. Epistemology is simply the study of knowledge in terms of its. And how do we know anything? How do we learn anything? Let's talk about that for a bit. When we were very, very small and in a playpen, our world, that was our boundaries that we could deal with. In that environment, we got a little familiarity with acoustics, visual colors, touch and textures, three-dimensional perception began to take place, basic motor skills to be able to reach and pick up and so forth. Then as we matured, our world broadened to our playroom. Our universe expanded within the confines of our playroom. So we began to have more discernment of things. We began to get introduced to rules and an order to our routine. We faced increased challenges of things that we could deal with, but also increased hazards. Hopefully, with adequate supervision, nothing serious occurred. So as we matured, our next boundary was expanded to our homes. And there we had increased mobility and challenges. We had, again, hazards and even potential disasters if we failed to be responsive. And more and more subjection to guidance was essential as we had the mobility of our home. Pretty soon as we grow further, we got to school and our universe began to expand. We had even more increased mobility and challenges, increased hazards. Subjection to guidance was even more essential until we finally were members of the community, and we had to learn how to handle unanticipated events. And we more frequently encountered things that were less predictable. And we had to start qualifying our sources of guidance, not just our parents, but others in whom we could place or shouldn't place confidence. And of course, as we matured as adults, our universe expanded to the world itself. And again, more and more, it was incumbent upon us to qualify sources of information about the world that we live in. And ultimately, of course, we're now facing the cosmos itself, the universe in some much broader sense. And so, now as we went from the playpen, our epistemology was very heavily influenced by trial and error as we tried things and tried to learn from them. And we began to get some internal processing of what we were learning and, of course, getting some external guidance. As our boundaries expanded, our trial and error became less a percentage. More and more we had guidance. And as our boundaries continued to expand, the trial and error mode of our gathering information decreased, and our internal processing and external guidance becomes more and more paramount until we get further and further to we're finally facing the cosmos where the trial and error factor is pretty de minimis. It's pretty hard to conduct experiments on the universe itself. And yet more and more are we dependent upon qualifying sources of information for guidance. And so that's a perspective from which there are some issues that we're facing. Cosmic issues. Is the universe infinite or finite? The great discovery of 20th century science was the discovery and the realization that the universe is not infinite, it's finite. How long has it been there? All kinds of guesses. A very elusive science at best. More to the point, was it designed or simply the result of some kind of cosmic accident?
One of the things that I like about the how long has it been here, and Chuck gets into this a little bit, is one of the presumptions of modern science and science historically is that things have basically the steady state model. Things have just always kind of been the same. So things happen gradually and slowly over time. The universe has always been here and is infinite. Those were all presuppositions that science made, and they've just been slowly picked away at and torn down. I'm not sure where we're at as far as the speed of light, but I think there's a very real possibility that the speed of light has changed. The other crazy thing, and I watched I think it was a Mark Rober video, just a regular secular scientist. He was talking about how we can't actually measure the speed of light. We can only measure it there and back. And so we don't actually know the true speed of light one way. So it's really interesting. What science has does and doesn't know these days, and how many of the basic tenets of science have just been shaken. And every time a basic tenet of science is shaken, it turns out the Bible was speaking about it properly and correctly thousands of years ago, which is just crazy.
It's really quite astonishing to see learned people come to very, very bizarre conclusions. Are there limits to size? How large is the universe? How small are the smallest elements? That may be surprising, what we've discovered about that. We speak of empty space. Is space really empty? Has time always been the same? Are there other dimensions beyond the four that we experience directly, the three spatial dimensions in time? Those are issues. So we're going to explore the boundaries of our reality, and that's going to be our primary epistemological challenge in this session. And to illusions of various kinds. And these illusions can be colorful minor things, or they can be very profound issues that we're facing. So first thing we're going to try to do is develop a critical perspective. There are two concepts very frequently discussed in mathematics that we cannot find in our physical universe, surprisingly enough. One is infinity. We talk about it, we put it in equations, we can deal with it conceptually. Can we find anything in our universe that's really infinite? And the other concept that's just as elusive is a concept called randomness. Randomness. There are mathematical tests for a series of numbers to see if they're random or not. It turns out that if you're faced with designing a computer and you need a source of random numbers, that turns out to be a major challenge, because we discover there is no such thing as randomness. There are things that come close to randomness. In the computer field, you have what's called pseudo-random number generators, because a true random number turns out to be surprisingly absent from our physical universe. That leads to a whole field of mathematics called the theory of chaos. We're also going to talk a little bit about the existence of hyperspaces, fancy word for simply spaces that have more than 3 dimensions. We're going to talk about this to broaden our own personal horizons a bit here. So these two imputed concepts. The first is randomness. The professional term for this is entropy. You'll hear thermodynamics people others speak of entropy. Entropy is simply randomness in an absolute sense. And most engineers and scientists are trained in deterministic process. 2 + 2 = 4 always. 2 + 3 = 5 always, precisely. Those are deterministic concepts. In our real world, we encounter a field of processes that we call stochastic processes, where one or more of the variables involved are subject to randomness to some degree. And the whole field of advanced statistics deals with this. One of the frontiers of science called the design of experiments. How do you design experiments when you can't control all the variables? The major frontier, very powerful critical tools involved there. The pseudo-random number area is an area that surprises many, because you think that you could always find a random number. Try it sometime. You might resort to the famous publication by the Rand Corporation, 100 million random digits. And it turns out even that, while it passes a number of tests, is not truly random. And that leads, of course, to a whole field of science called chaos theory that we won't spend time on here. But there are measures of information that we need to be sensitive to. We realize that there are opposites. If we speak of disorder and order, those in some respects are opposite from one another. We can tell when something is ordered. We can tell when something is disordered. You can take a deck of cards and you can see if they're in bridge order, for example, or if they're shuffled and totally apparently random. So disorder and order are opposites. Noise and signals are opposites. An engineer will speak of the signal-to-noise ratio of a receiver. The signal is the part you're interested in. It's the part that carries information. The noise is what interferes with that has no information in it. Music, the opposite of that would be cacophony. And I'm sure many in our audience would suspect that in today's music it's hard to tell, but I won't go down that path here. Chaos, absolute chaos in contrast to cosmos. The term in the Greek of cosmos means ordered, to bring order out of chaos. So on the left, on the chart here, we have randomness. On the one hand, we have design, deliberate design or intent, teleology, if you will, on the other. We call that which is on the left, disorder, noise, cacophony, chaos, or randomness. The technical term for that collection of concepts is entropy. The entropy is maximized on the left side. On the right side, we call that information. It's the opposite of entropy. Order, signal, music, design. It's information. It's interesting that these two, entropy and information, are direct opposites of each other in the information sciences. And we also discover there seems to be a law pervading every field of science in which information tends to get degraded. Through time, entropy takes over. In fact, that becomes one of the primary laws in thermodynamics, is that we always move towards increasing entropy. The whole universe operates as if it's been wound up and is in the process of winding down, where we have order going to disorder. We see that in our garages. We spend a Saturday cleaning up the garage. How long does it stay that way? We clean up our locker in school, or we organize our desk. We spend a half a day straightening it all out. And how long does it take before it's helter-skelter again? See, there's a trend, without the intrusion of some design, things will drift to disorder, randomness. We observe that in every field of our endeavors. And it's interesting, the Bible makes reference to this. The lot is cast in the lap, but the whole disposing thereof is of the Lord. The way Einstein summarized this, Einstein said, God does not play dice. Do you know why? Because if he did, he'd win. He's in control even of the randomness. There is no such thing as a truly random event. So there's another concept that eludes us in our physical universe called infinity. We glibly talk about it in school, but where do we find it? Let's first explore infinity in the macrocosm, in the universe, in the large sense. And the great discovery of 20th century science, as I mentioned, is that the universe is finite, not infinite. And we have very finite boundaries. The initiation of the universe is known among some as the Big Bang, a singularity, and it ultimately will burn out and result in the ultimate heat death. All work is done by a temperature difference, and as work is done, that temperature difference decreases, and when the universe is of a total uniform temperature, no more work can be done, and the mathematical term would be ultimate heat death for the universe. See, in thermodynamics, we have three laws. The conservation of matter and energy is well known to most students, which says that you cannot create matter or energy. You can transfer matter into energy, energy into matter, but you can't create either one from scratch. In other words, first law says there's no way to win. The second law is the entropy law, the bondage of decay, that all thermodynamic processes are inefficient, less than 100%. There's some percent of the work that gets lost to the ambient temperature. And that's a very basic law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics, some people might rephrase that and say you can't even break even. There's no way to win, you can't even break even. The third law, many people are not familiar with, everything has a positive finite entropy. So the first law says there's no way to win. The second law says there's no way to break even. And the third law says you can't even get out of it.
Hi, I'm Jim Toole.
We'll focus very intensely on the second law before we get through here. Let's talk a little bit about thermal decay. Heat always flows from hot bodies to cold bodies. We experience that in many, many ways personally. If the universe was infinitely old, the temperature throughout the universe would be uniform, because heat would be always flowing to cold, and if it's infinitely large, you'd have a uniform temperature, and it isn't uniform, therefore it isn't infinitely old. This very simple observation tells you that the universe has an age. It's not infinite. And the universe had a beginning, and it's destined also for an ending for the very same reason. And that's what the Bible tells us, is that by him were all things created, that are in heaven, that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones, dominions, principalities, or powers. All things were created by him and for him. And he is before all things, and by him all things consist. That word consist actually means sustains, holds together. The astonishing thing isn't just that the creation has been created, is that it is maintained. There's some very delicate balances that we'll talk about shortly. The book of Hebrews says much the same thing. God, who at sundry times and divers manners spake in time past unto the fathers by the prophets, hath in these days spoken unto us by his Son, whom he hath appointed heir of all things, by whom also he made the worlds, who being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, upholding all things by the word of his power, when he had by himself purged our sins, sat down on the right hand of majesty on high. Wow. Upholding all things by the word of his power. The need for maintaining the creation is something we're going to encounter as we get into this further. Now, this idea of the beginning, it having a beginning, has led to a series of speculations that go by the name the Big Bang. Basically, the Big Bang says first there was nothing, and then it exploded. If that makes sense to you, you're welcome to it. But the first model, called the steady state model, Einstein admitted was his biggest mistake of his career. It was replaced in the 60s by the hesitation model, which was refuted in the 60s for a number of reasons. Then it was replaced by an oscillation model. It expanded and contracted, this kind of thing. And that's refuted by the entropy laws and also the lack of mass. The current thinking is pretty much along the lines of what's called the inflation model. The problem with it requires anti-gravity forces that have never been observed. So these are just speculations. They're attempts by people to speculate on how it all began. There's another factor, and I'm going to call it the stretch factor. The expanding universe appears to be involved in expansion of about 10 to the 12th. And that comes from the temperature of the quark confinement when matter freezes out energy. And we don't have to go down the physics path there to justify this estimate. But it's interesting that with an expansion of 10 to the 12th, scientists estimate that the universe is about 16 billion years old. Well, that turns out to be about 6 times 10 to the 12th days. And so with that expansion factor, you come to the same term that God himself used with his own finger when he wrote it in stone in the book of Exodus chapter 20, that 6 days it was created. If you take the exponential factor, it would imply that these days, from God's point of view, are 15 billion years old. What kind of clock was running at the time? We don't know, because Adam hadn't been created yet. So it depends whose clock you're talking about. And there's a whole issue there of just how old the earth is. It turns out, can it be 6 days or 16 billion? Both are probably true, each in their respective frames of reference. But stretching the heavens, let's talk about the fabric of space. Is this more than a metaphor? In the scripture it says, it speaks of God who alone stretches out the heavens. In Psalms, he's stretching out the heaven like a tent curtain. In Isaiah, he who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them out like a tent to dwell in. He has stretched out the heavens. The Lord who stretches out the heavens, in Zechariah and so forth. We have literally dozens of references where this same term is used throughout the Bible. Is it just a figure of speech? Today we discover that space is not, as most of us suppose, an empty vacuum. It can be torn, according to Isaiah 64. It can be worn out like a garment, according to Psalm 102. It can be shaken, in a number of references. It can be burnt. It will be burnt up, according to 2 Peter 3. It can split apart like a scroll in Revelation 6. It can be rolled up like a mantle or a scroll, in both Hebrews and Isaiah use that frame of reference. Well, that's an interesting clue here, what we're talking about. The properties of space. We know today that empty space has an energy level that's astonishing, 100 million suns equivalent, 10 to the 95th ergs per cubic centimeter. We'll talk about that in a minute. It has permittivity, magnetic, or actually a dielectric constant. It has permeability, a magnetic constant. Any amateur radio operator knows he's got to tune his antenna to the electrical properties of space itself. The intrinsic impedance, which derives from both of those, and then the velocity of light, which is presently estimated to be more than 2 times 10 to the 10th its present velocity at creation. It's currently at the speed of gravity. And the fact that the velocity of light has been changing is the astonishing discovery of just the last few years. And so there's a major upheaval going on in the field of physics as we realize that these things we thought were constants are not constants. And we'll talk about that in a minute. 0-point energy. If the temperature of an empty container is lowered to absolute zero, there still retains a residual amount of thermal energy that cannot by any means be removed. So that's why they call it the 0-point energy. What we think of as a vacuum, we now know is a vast reservoir of seething energy out of which particles are being formed and annihilated constantly. Why doesn't an electron, as it spins around its nucleus, get attracted by the nucleus and simply radiate energy and spiral into the nucleus? You get the picture there? You'd think it would just disappear. It picks up energy from the background 0-point energy and therefore is sustained by it. So there is a sustaining going on right at the atomic level. How about being rolled up? There's some dimension in which space must be thin if it can be rolled up, and it also must have some direction that it can be bent toward. So these terms in the scripture give us a clue that there are dimensions to space beyond the ones we experience. You and I think of a 3-dimensional space, length, width, and height. 3 dimensions are what we think of embraces space. We now know today there's more to it than that. There are additional spatial dimensions, and the Bible has said that all along. So let's talk a little bit about hyperdimensions, which is simply a term for spaces of more than 3 dimensions. And we're going to go beyond Euclid. Most of us have taught in school what we call Euclidean geometry. But it turns out that the most important speech in mathematics was given on June 10th of 1854 when George Riemann introduced us to metric tensors. The mathematics, it took 60 years before that mathematics would yield the theory of relativity by Dr. Einstein, which he discovered in 1915, the 4-dimensional space-time. We're going to talk a little bit about that in more detail in the next session, but we know today that you and I don't live in 3 dimensions, we live in at least 4. Length, width, height, 3 spatial dimensions, and time is a 4th dimension. A physicist will never speak of space or time separately. If he's careful, he'll always speak of space-time. Space and time can't be separated. The Planck's constant is a 4-dimensional constant. And Kaluza-Klein in 53, Einstein went to his death frustrated because he couldn't resolve other issues. If he'd done the same thing he did to resolve the first one, simply go up a level, it would have yielded. And in 53, a couple by the name of Kaluza and Klein went beyond the 4 dimensions and resolved the light and supergravity issues. And then in 1963, Yang and Mills went further to establish the electromagnetic and nuclear forces, combining all of them into a multidimensional perspective. And in 1984 and following, the current speculations have to do with superstrings. Most particle physicists will tell you they believe we live in at least 10 dimensions, not just the 3 that we directly experience or the 4, including time, much more than that. The dimensions of reality. It's interesting to notice that an ancient Hebrew scholar by the name of Nachmanides, who wrote in the 13th century, he, in his commentary on the book of Genesis, he concludes that the universe has 10 dimensions. Only 4 are knowable in his vocabulary. 6 are not knowable. Well, particle physicists today, in the 20th century, have discovered, or they now believe, that there are 10 dimensions. 4 are directly measurable, 3 spatial dimensions in time. 6 are curled in less than 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, and thus are inferable only by indirect means, because they're smaller than light itself. This fascinates me that we've spent millions of dollars building atomic accelerators to discover what Nachmanides discovered by just reading carefully Genesis chapter 1. Hyperspaces. There are only 2 kinds of people that are able to deal with hyperspaces. Mathematicians with special training and small children. They have no trouble with this at all. But you and I can get some insights into dimensionality. We can't go up without special training, so to speak. But we can look down. In our imagination, we can look down from our 3-dimensional world down to a 2-dimensional world and draw some insights from this. So I want to introduce you to Mr. and Mrs. Flat. I want you to be compassionate because Mr. and Mrs. Flat suffer from a very serious handicap. They live in only 2 dimensions, and they live in a 2-dimensional universe. And so if we can imagine a universe of only 2 dimensions, and we're dealing here with what in school we'd call plane geometry. Plane, it's flat. 2-dimensional universe. Mr. and Mrs. Flat are there. If you and I come along as a 3-dimensional being, we can be more intimate with either one of them than they can with each other. They could be yards apart, and we could, because of our additional dimensionality, be a millionth of an inch from each of them. So we enjoy a proximity that's totally independent of the distance between them, because we have an additional dimension. This is just one example. We could go on with other examples. If we managed to penetrate the 2-dimensional world, they would behold us as simply a circle, because they have no conception of the space beyond the 2 dimensions that they have availability. If a sphere should fall through their 2-dimensional universe, it would show up as a dot, expand to a circle, shrink back to a dot, and disappear. There are serious scientists that believe that UFOs are hyperdimensional events. There are many that believe that angels are hyperdimensional creatures. And those are speculations, but they can be justified from the insights we have from modern science so far, at least. Well, how would you communicate a 3-dimensional object to a 2-dimensional universe? Suppose we had a reason we wanted to communicate to Mr. and Mrs. Flat our 3-dimensionality. How would we do it? Well, one way to try to do is let's make a 2-dimensional projection. We do that in drawings. We have what we call a projection. That's not too useful. If I take a 3-dimensional projection of a 4-dimensional hypercube, it's really not very useful. There's some of these on the internet you can play with, but as you play with them, all they really convince you of is you can't instinctively really understand what's going on. Not very useful. Another way we might try to communicate a 3-dimensional object into 2 dimensions is to unravel it into 2 dimensions. We might take a cube and unfold it like a box into a 2-dimensional representation of the box. Well, we suspect that if we did this, Mr. and Mrs. Flat would still have a hard time perceiving what we really meant by a 3-dimensional cube. There is a 4-dimensional cube that's been unraveled in 3 dimensions. It's called a tesseract. And the only place I've ever seen one, other than a mathematics textbook, is in a piece of art, a very interesting piece of art by Salvador Dali, Corpus Christi, where he renders the cross as a 4-dimensional cube unraveled in 3 dimensions. It astonished me to realize that Salvador Dali had that sophistication in topology and mathematics to be able to even understand what he was saying there. Very effective use of it, as a matter of fact. But I want to show you another passage in the book, in the letter to Ephesians. In Ephesians chapter 3, Paul writes that Christ may dwell in your hearts by faith, that ye, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all saints what is the breadth and length and depth and height, and to know the love of Christ which passes knowledge, that ye might be filled with the fullness of God. As you read that letter, you may miss something unless you look carefully. Have you noticed this? How many dimensions is Paul writing about? The breadth, the length, the depth, and height. 4 dimensions, one of which is a Greek term that can embrace time. Kind of interesting. 4 dimensions. The Bible's really said that all along. So we've been through randomness. We're now infinity. We've talked about the macrocosm, our universe that is finite in the macro sense. Let's take a look at the microcosm, at the smallness. We know the universe has a limit to how big it is. It may astonish you to realize there is a limit to smallness. And we call that quantum physics for some very interesting reasons. If I told you that this podium I'm speaking of is empty and not solid at all, and you took the view that no, it's obviously solid, do you realize that I am 10 to the 15th more accurate than you are? If we take an atom, a simple atom being a nucleus surrounded by an electron, turns out, this is obviously not drawn to scale, because the atom is 10 to the minus 8 centimeters in diameter, the nucleus 10 to the minus 13th, okay? That's a difference between the two is 10 to the minus 5, or 10 to the 5th, you're going to divide it. So if you take that volumetrically, 10 to the 5th, and cube it, you got 10 to the 15th. How big is 10 to the 15th? Well, that's not very distant from the number of seconds in the universe. If you take 16 billion years old and divide it into seconds, you have about 10 to the 16th, 10 to the 17th. Almost, this number almost reaches that kind. It's a
just an unimaginable size, 10 to the 15th. That is just a mind-boggling number.
very, very large number, which means simply this, that most of this podium is actually empty space.
Mm-hmm.
It feels solid because of an electrical simulation being occurred between atoms that sense each other's nearness.
Yep, essentially the electrons repel against each other. Two likes repel. Dissimilar things attract. Opposites attract, like repel. So your electrons actually push against the other physical objects that are in its way. And like you said, that's why he calls it an electrical simulation, which is not a bad way to describe it, but one that we don't hear very often.
But it's mostly empty by a factor of 1 part in 10 to the 15th. So if I say there's nothing here, I'm 10 to the 15th more close to reality than you are if you say this is solid, because it's obviously not solid. There's no such thing as solid, it turns out. If we take a line and cut it in half, we can take what's left and cut it in half again. We can take what's left and cut it in half again and keep doing that. You would think that we could keep doing that, at least conceptually, forever. That no matter what we have left, we can cut it in half. It turns out that that's not true. It turns out that when we get to 10 to the minus 35 centimeters, if we try to cut that in half, whatever's there loses locality. It's suddenly everywhere at one instant. And an astonishing number of experiments back in 1982 confirmed this whole idea of what they call the Bell inequality. The net of it is that all photons in the universe know what all the other photons are doing. They're all interconnected in some strange way. And that's what leads, by David Bohm and others, to what they call the holographic model of the universe. But the very fact that subatomic particles have a property that's known as non-locality is astonishing. And this is true not just of length, it's true of mass, energy, and time. The Planck length here is 10 to the minus 33. The Planck time is 10 to the minus 43 seconds. There's no time smaller than 10 to the minus 43 seconds. The entire universe is made up of digits. It's a digital simulation. And so we have infinity. At the macrocosm, it's finite. At the microcosm, it's finite. That's what leads to the field of, they call these indivisible units quanta, and the study of them is called quantum physics. And so we discover that you and I are in a physical universe that has boundaries. There's a finiteness of this, a very large, but still a finite size on the macro side, and it's also made up of indivisible units on the small side. It has a grain. It's digital, not analog, in effect. There's a movie that came out some time ago called The 13th Floor, which has nothing to do really with the major plot of the movie, but I think it's instructive to take a perspective of it. The movie in Los Angeles in 2005, a group of computer experts built a virtual simulation of a city and people, and they chose to create Los Angeles 1937 in this imaginary virtual environment, and all software. It was a virtual environment and populated with virtual people. And what made the thing kind of interesting is that they call the people in the software system a program unit, and people from the real world could enter that world for a brief period of time, for an hour or so, by exchanging their consciousness with the consciousness of the virtual people. This is obviously just a science fiction story, but very cleverly crafted. And so these people were able to go for a while in LA in 1937 and live for an hour or so in the bodies of the people, certain people there. And in the plot line of the story here, a murder mystery takes place. There is a major program manager that has been murdered, and it turns out the key to solving that murder is in the virtual environment. And that causes our hero in the story to have to go into there to try to solve, because they're going to pin this murder on him if he can't solve it, and that's what the plot line has to do with. And where the plot takes a huge twist is they discover there are other people entering LA 2005, and it turns out when the smoke finally clears, they're coming from LA 2025. And they discover then, as they realize all this, that even they themselves and the world they're in is a virtual environment. And there's, it's very cleverly crafted science fiction story. But what makes the thing so provocative, just a piece of entertainment, don't misunderstand me, just a piece of entertainment, but it's conceptually provocative here, because that's exactly the predicament we find ourselves in. That we are in an environment, while we may make virtual games and things and so forth, that in fact we ourselves are in a simulated environment that in which there's a reality beyond ours. And Scientific American in June of 2005 wrote an article about constants. We're going to get out here in a minute. But they concluded tentatively that our reality that we live in is but a shadow of a larger reality. That's their words, not mine. And so we find ourselves very analogous to that situation. We're here, man is here, and let's do a spread of size. On the large scale size, we have astronomy and astrophysics, the universe, but we discover it's finite. The macrocosm is finite. On the small side, we have indivisible units. That leads to quantum physics. Subatomic particles cease to have locality if they're divided. And that's at the microcosm. So we find ourselves, fascinatingly, inside a digital simulation. Everything we have is made up of indivisible units. It's like a piano rather than a violin. A violin is analog. A piano is digital. You have to hit one of the keys that are there. And that's exactly what they're discovering with the red shift. The red shift is digitized. That shakes everybody up. So there are finite limits to the simulated world we find ourselves in. And we can go one step further and call this total thing the metacosm and talk about it, but we'll have to get some. And it's Scientific American 2005 says, our universe is but a shadow of a larger reality, is their conclusion from the fact that the constants of the universe we're now discovering are not really constant at all. And Paul Davies, a secular scientist, says, it seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming.
Yes, it is.
When they try to build a mathematical model, a three-dimensional model of the universe, they discover there are relationships that cannot be violated or it all falls apart. It's very, very tightly tuned. And they call it's as if it was all designed for mankind. So this concept that they encounter is called by them the anthropic principle. It's as if the universe was designed for man. Let's take a look at it. It's the appearance that the universe was designed in constructing the model we believe that we know about. Of everything we know about the universe, there are hundreds of delicate ratios, if altered in the slightest, would render life impossible. And sometimes 1 part in 10 to the 55th, surprisingly enough. understand the universe, there are four basic forces that are encountered. Gravity we all know about, electromagnetic force we know about, and there's two nuclear forces, strong and weak nuclear forces. These four forces explain everything that we know about in the universe. Gravity that's what causes an apple to fall to the ground, keeps our feet on the floor, binds together our solar system, keeps the Earth and the planets in their orbits in effect, prevents the stars from exploding, and guides the galaxies in their motion. That's what gravity is all about. There's another force that operates closer in called electromagnetic force. It holds the atom together. It determines the structure of the orbits of the electrons and therefore all chemistry, governs the laws of chemistry. The forms of electromagnetic force can include X-rays, radio waves, and of course light. And it can overcome gravity on the Earth. So for short distances, it can overcome gravity. And it can dominate other forces down to the size of the nucleus of an atom. There things start to change. That's where we encounter two nuclear forces. The strong nuclear force is what binds the protons and neutrons in the nucleus of the atom. The balance between the strong force and the electromagnetic forces limit a nucleus to about 100 protons, and that's what limits basically what we know as the periodic table. The energy release is substantially greater than electromagnetic, that is the chemical forces, and thus that's what causes stars to shine, essential for life and so forth. The weak nuclear force governs atomic instability and radioactivity, the disintegration of heavier nuclei. It can create heat, such as the decay of radioactive elements in the Earth's core, or in a nuclear power plant. So these are four. Now, the gravitational coupling, if let's just take each one of these. If the gravitational coupling was a little bit stronger, all stars more massive than our sun by about 1.4 times, they burn too rapidly, they do inconstantly to maintain life-supporting conditions on surrounding planets. If it was just a little bit weaker, all stars would have less than 0.8 times the mass of our sun. There would be no heavy elements in the universe. Electromagnetic coupling. If it was a little weaker, the molecules of life would cease to exist. If it was slightly stronger, the molecules for life would cease to exist. It happens to be just at the right amount. The strong nuclear force coupling. If it was slightly weaker, multi-proton nuclei would not hold together. Hydrogen would be the only element in the universe. If it was slightly stronger, nuclear particles tend to bond together more frequently and more firmly. Hydrogen would be very rare in the universe, and the supply of various life-essential elements would be heavier than iron, would be insufficient. The weak force coupling. If it was larger, there'd be no helium, no heavy elements. If it was weaker, everything would be helium, and there'd be an overabundance of heavy elements. The ratio of electron to proton mass. If it was larger, the molecules would not form, life would be impossible. If it was smaller, molecules would not form and life would be impossible. It happens to be just at the amount it has to be. The distance from the sun. If we were closer, it'd be too warm for a stable water cycle. If it was further, it'd be too cold to have one. Surface gravity. If it was stronger, the atmosphere would have too much ammonia and methane. If it was weaker, atmosphere would lose too much water. The thickness of the Earth's crust. If it was too much oxygen if it was thicker, too much oxygen would be transferred from the atmosphere to the crust. If it was thinner, volcanic and tectonic activity would be too great. It's right in an ideal balance. The Earth's rotation period. If it was just a little bit longer, the diurnal temperature differences would be too great. If the days were too short, it would get too hot and too cold, if you will. If it was slightly shorter, the atmospheric wind velocities would be too great. These are all discoveries that are astonishing people to realize how delicate everything seems to be balanced. The axial tilt. If it was greater, the surface temperatures would be too great. And if it was less, the surface temperature would be too great for different reasons, obviously. And the albedo, that's the reflectivity of the planet. If it was a little greater, a runaway ice age would develop. If it was a little less, a runaway greenhouse effect would develop. It's just at that right balance. The Earth's magnetic field, if it was stronger, the electromagnetic storms would be too severe. If it was weaker, there'd be inadequate protection from the hard stellar radiation. The ozone level, I love this one. If it was greater by just a little bit, surface temperatures would be too low. If it was less, surface temperature would be too high and too much ultraviolet radiation to the surface. But the reason I think this is kind of interesting is the ecologists tell us that, gee, if the ozone level was just a fraction of a percent, a tenth of a percent more or less, it brings cosmic doom. When they say that, turn that coin over. If it's that delicate, who balanced it in the first place? The fact that it's that delicate is an argument that it didn't occur randomly.
Mm-hmm.
By the degree it's rare to the degree it excludes randomness as a source. Furthermore, it raises another issue. Not only who balanced it, who is maintaining the balance? If it's that delicate, it would be intrinsically unstable unless there were countervailing factors involved. CO2 and water vapor. If it was greater, runaway greenhouse effect would develop, and if it was less, the greenhouse effect would be insufficient. So at the atomic and subatomic level, the slightest variation in any of the primary constants of physics, some is less than 1 part in a million, causes life to be impossible. And that's just a reality. The more rare these relationships are, the more they unequivocally reveal both skillful design in their origin and diligence in their maintenance. That's something that's often overlooked. They have to be maintained. You know, the ancient cultures created false gods of wood, stone, whatever, to worship. Our cultures invented the most insulting god of all that we choose to worship. Randomness, the total absence of information. We've chosen to worship the absence of information. Ignorance, strangely enough. Of all the gods, false gods that man has worshipped, this one, the one we embrace in our culture, is the most insulting of all. In 1954, Sir Fred Hoyle, a scientist, predicted using the anthropic principle and then discovered the previously unknown energy of levels in the carbon-12 atom from its sensitivity to the prevalent patterns of numerical design in the universe. Very interesting event because he used the anthropic principle predictively. They were struggling with a carbon-12 issue, and he predicted a level of energy that they then tooled up and discovered was there, but he predicted it in advance of its discovery by applying the anthropic principle, a very, very interesting event from the point of view of science. You're going to hear more and more a term called the privileged planet, because not only is this planet that we live in uniquely positioned for life. As they study the universe and its billions and billions of galaxies and the number of planets that might be around those stars, they discover the offset is the rarity of the conditions for life are so rare that it still doesn't, it comes to the conclusion that we are unique in the universe, strangely enough. But we are also not only uniquely positioned for life, they've discovered something else. We're uniquely positioned to discover. The fact that you can have this first occurred to some scientists, they were watching the eclipse of the sun. The moon is exactly the right size and the right distance to create a total eclipse. If it was a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller, you would not be able to see the corona. And by being able to see the corona, they were able to analyze it and discover not only what the sun is made out of, but by discovering that spectroanalysis, they can tell what other stars are made out of. But they also discovered it was as if it was tuned, not just for life, it's tuned to allow us to discover. As they begin to analyze our position in our galaxy, we're not too close or too far from the center to be able to see the rest of the universe.
My favorite psalm is Psalm 19, and it says, "The heavens declare the glory of God." And that's what we were designed to discover. We can see God's handiwork throughout all of creation. We can definitely see it in the stars and in the heavens, and it's absolutely beautiful. It's something that I've always loved. I love astronomy. It's my favorite science. Love Star Trek, love all those stories in space. Star Wars, my favorite. But that's what we were created to discover. Is we were created to discover God through the heavens.
And just as we have an array of tuning that's going on here to make life possible, we also are discovering there's an array of issues, dozens of them, that have been tuned to allow us the opportunity to discover. The fact that our eyes are sensitive to the visible, a very, very small part of the electromagnetic spectrum, but it's that very part of the spectrum that allows us to discover the universe itself. It says not only are we placed here as a beneficiary of life, we're also placed here as a beneficiary of the opportunity to discover. And we're positioned in the galaxy, positioned for total eclipses, positioned with the visible spectrum, and it goes on and on, dozens of these things. This implies more than accident. This implies teleology, a purpose. Not only are we designed, it indicates there was a purpose in the design. And there's a recent book out, The Privileged Planet, by Gonzalez and Richards, that I encourage you to get. There's also an astonishing video out by them, which uses computer graphics to demonstrate all these things. It's absolutely breathtaking. I encourage you to check into it. But I'd like to talk a little further about the constants of the universe in another way. It turns out that many of these constants that have dimensions are very, very sensitive. But there's two constants in the universe that are dimensionless. One that you're probably very familiar with, and one that you're probably not familiar with unless you've been active in very advanced engineering or math, what have you. The first one is pi. We all learned that in school, that the relationship between a circumference and a diameter is 3.14159, a bunch of other numbers. We call that pi. It's the ratio of the diameter to the circumference. That turns out to be true no matter what units you're measuring with. It's metric or English or what you name it. That relationship is intrinsic to the relationship between the diameter and a circle. There's another one called a natural logarithm, log to the base e, and I'll talk about that in a minute. It's kind of interesting to discover there are two key verses in the Bible about creation. Obviously, Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, and so forth. All things were made by Him. Without Him was not anything made that was made. So these are the two key passages in the entire Bible on creation. Well, it's been called to my attention that if you take the first verse of the Bible in the Hebrew, and Hebrew letters and Greek letters have the distinctive that they have numerical values, each one of them. And if you take the Hebrew here, Bereshit, bara, Elohim, and so forth, you take the number of letters times the product of letters, and you divide that by the number of words times the product of the words, you end up, interesting enough, with pi to 4 decimal places, 3.14116, 4 decimal places. You say, well, gee, that's kind of a strange coincidence, but it is what it is. It turns out John Napier, who was a mathematician in the 16th, 17th century, activist for the Reformation and the Protestant affairs in Scotland, turns out, he was the inventor of what we know today as logarithms. The natural and Napierian logarithms, or logs to the base e, or sometimes called natural logarithms. He also established the use of a decimal point in fractions. But the number e shows up in advanced math. Unless you've been in calculus or advanced math, you probably never run into it. It is a very unique kind of number. It has a limiting value of about 2.7183, or 28 on. It forms the base of the natural logarithms. It appears as an exponential function. It's the only function having a rate of growth equal to its own size. In the language of calculus, it's the only function having a derivative equal to itself. And therefore, it's a fundamental function for certain equations of growth and other processes. So they show up in wave mechanics. It shows up in electrical theory, advanced math, distribution of prime numbers. It shows up in the strangest places. And if you've been in advanced math, you've come across E as frequently as a geometry student comes across pi, if you will. Well, if you take the first the key verse of creation in the New Testament, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, John 1:1. You take that in the Greek, and there again do the same thing we did before. The number of letters times the product of letters divided by the number of words times the product of words. Guess what? It comes to E, to 4 decimal places. Now, I don't know what you're going to do with that piece of information. It doesn't prove anything, but it certainly gets our attention. You see, the rabbis have a very strange view about the Torah. They not only believe God created the universe, they believe the Torah contains the templates by which he did it. Rather interesting point of view. But there are recent articles in some of the journals because they're discovering that the things that they thought were constant aren't. The speed of light was regarded as a constant. I was taken to dinner by a number of my old friends that were upset because I was publishing in our news journal over a decade ago articles by Barry Setterfield arguing that the speed of light is not a constant, that it's been slowing down. And my well-meaning Christian physicist friends said, "Chuck, you're going down the wrong path. Everybody knows that there's nothing more sacred than the constancy of the speed of light. It undergirds most of physics." I was deaf to that. Was polite, but deaf to that. And it turns out that within the last couple of years, there's a number of articles in reputable journals that are discovering, my goodness, the speed of light is not a constant. And none of them had the character or the integrity to make reference to Barry Setterfield, who've been saying that for several decades. But nevertheless, they're now waking up to the fact that the constants of the universe are not constant. And there's studies going on to try to concern themselves with that. In Scientific American in June 2005, I love this phrase, they believe that our reality, our three-dimensional reality, is but a shadow of a larger reality. That's something the Bible has been saying all along. And we read that earlier. So we're going to go to the next part 2 of this What is Truth excursion. In examining our boundaries, we're going to talk specifically about the time domain because it's going to be very useful to do so. We'll talk about entropy as the arrow of dimensionality to the time domain. We'll talk about negentropy being essential for life. We'll talk about extraterrestrial sources of information that we can draw upon, and how we qualify sources of information, and how we test hypotheses. So join me for part 2.
All right, we will save part 2 for, I believe, tomorrow. I'm going to try to stream tomorrow evening. That was a very wonderful teaching from Chuck Missler. He's very knowledgeable when it comes to the Bible, but also when it comes to the realities of our universe. He's got an engineering background. He had a decades-long career in the business world, culminating in him being the CEO of Western Digital. You likely have some of the products that company has created in your computer or around your computer right now. So he knows his stuff when it comes to engineering, and praise God, he knows his stuff when it comes to the Bible, and he combines them in some very unique and interesting ways. So, like I said, we will finish this off next week. Now we need to get Bible Gateway open so we can do our Bible reading. What are we on? We are on Exodus 11. And we are going to be doing Luke 5. So Exodus 11 and 12 and Luke 5 and 6. Right. So, as always, we are reading out of the New King James Version. That's just my preferred version. Just a little background. When I started getting a lot more serious about my faith, I was looking around for a Bible to use, and I was fortunate enough to find my grandfather's New King James Bible. He was a Baptist minister, ultimately up in Jackson, California at the end of his life. And he had a huge impact on my faith. I was fortunate enough to be baptized by him. So he had a great New King James Study Bible with the center column with all the footnotes and references, kind of like we have here online. So that's just the reason why I use a New King James. The NASB is a great translation. The ESV, there's plenty of really good translations out there. So I'm not one of those King James only types. Certainly not. There's quite a few good translations, and I think it's healthy to use the different translations to check out what exactly a verse means if you're having trouble understanding what it says. And then I also like what's called the interlinear translations, where they'll literally just show you the Greek or Hebrew or whatever language word, and then they will show you what that word means in English, and they don't change any of the formatting, just word for word translations. It looks kind of funny, but it can really help you dig down and figure out what a verse is saying. All right, so now without any further ado, we will start off with Exodus chapter 11. And the Lord said to Moses, I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt. Afterward he will let you go from here. When he lets you go, he will surely drive you out of here altogether. Speak now in the hearing of the people, and let every man ask from his neighbor, and every woman from her neighbor, articles of silver and articles of gold. And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants, and in the sight of the people. Then Moses said, Thus says the Lord, about midnight I will go out into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die. From the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the female servant who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of the animals. Then there shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as was not like it before, nor shall be like it again. But against none of the children of Israel shall a dog move its tongue, against man or beast, that you may know that the Lord does make a difference between the Egyptians, and Israel. And all these your servants shall come down to me, and bow down to me, saying, Get out, and all the people who follow you. After that I will go out. Then he went out from Pharaoh in great anger. But the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh will not heed you, so that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt. So Moses and Aaron did all these wonders before Pharaoh, and the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the children of Israel go out of his land. Chapter 12. Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, On the 10th of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb, according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of the persons. According to each man's need you shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. Now you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight. And they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses where they eat it. Then they shall eat the flesh on that night, roasted in fire, with unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat it raw, nor boiled at all with water, but roasted in fire, its head with its legs and its entrails. You shall let none of it remain until morning, and what remains of it until morning you shall burn with fire. And thus you shall eat it, with a belt on your waist, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. So you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. Now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So this day shall be to you a memorial, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. You shall keep it as a feast by an everlasting ordinance. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day there shall be a holy convocation, and on the 7th day there shall be a holy convocation for you. No manner of work shall be done on them, but that which everyone must eat, that only may be prepared by you. So you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this same day I will have brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as an everlasting ordinance. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. For 7 days no leaven shall be found in your houses, since whoever eats what is leavened, that same person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel. Whether he is a stranger or a native of the land, you shall eat nothing leavened, and in all your dwellings you shall eat unleavened bread. Then Moses called for the elders of Israel and said to them, Pick out and take lambs for yourselves according to your families, and kill the Passover lamb. And you shall take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and strike the lintel and the 2 doorposts with the blood that is in the basin. And none of you shall go out of the door of his house until morning. For the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to come into your houses to strike you. And you shall observe this thing as an ordinance for you and your sons forever. It will come to pass when you come to the land which the Lord will give you, just as he promised, that you shall keep this service. And it shall be, when your children say to you, What do you mean by this service? That you shall say, It is the Passover sacrifice of the Lord, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt, when he struck the Egyptians and delivered our households. So the people bowed their heads and worshipped. Then the children of Israel went away and did so, just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. And it came to pass at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon. and all the firstborn of livestock. So Pharaoh rose in the night, he, all his servants, and all the Egyptians. And there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. Then he called for Moses and Aaron by night, and said, Rise, go out from among my people, both you and the children of Israel, and go, serve the Lord as you have said. Also take your flocks and your herds, as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also. And the Egyptians urged the people that they might send them out of the land in haste, for they said, We shall all be dead. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, having their kneading bowls bound up in their clothes on their shoulders. Now the children of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, and they had asked from the Egyptians articles of silver, articles of gold, and clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they granted them what they requested. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. Then the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides children. A mixed multitude went up with them also, and flocks and herds, a great deal of livestock. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough which they had brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were driven out of Egypt and could not wait, nor had they prepared provisions for themselves. Now the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt was 430 years. And it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, on that very same day, it came to pass that all the armies of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It is a night of solemn observance to the Lord for bringing them out of the land of Egypt. This is the night of the Lord, a solemn observance for all the children of Israel throughout their generations. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, This is the ordinance of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat it, but every man's servant who is bought for money, when you have circumcised him, then he may eat it. A sojourner and a hired servant shall not eat it. If in one house it shall be eaten, and you shall not carry any of the flesh outside the house, nor shall you break one of its bones. All the congregation of Israel shall keep it. And when a stranger dwells with you and wants to keep the Passover of the Lord, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near and keep it. And he shall be as a native of the land, for no uncircumcised person shall eat it. One law shall be for the native born and for the stranger who dwells among you. Thus all the children of Israel did, as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. And it came to pass on that very same day that the Lord brought the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt, according to their armies. All right, so those were our chapters from Exodus. We did 11 and 12. We're going to move over to Luke. All right, Luke, chapter 5. So it was, as the multitude pressed about him to hear the word of God, that he stood by the lake of Gennesaret, and saw 2 boats standing by the lake. But the fishermen had gone from them and were washing their nets. Then he got into one of the boats, which was Simon's, and asked him to put out a little from the land. And he sat down and taught the multitudes from the boat. When he had stopped speaking, he said to Simon, Launch out into the deep, and let down your nets for a catch. But Simon answered and said to him, Master, we have toiled all night and caught nothing. Nevertheless, at your word I will let down the net. And when they had done this, they caught a great number of fish, and their net was breaking. So they signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both the boats, so that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord. For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish which they had taken. And so also were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, Do not be afraid. From now on you will catch men. So when they had brought their boats to land, they forsook all and followed him. And it happened when he was in a certain city, that behold, a man who was full of leprosy saw Jesus, and he fell on his face and implored him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Then he put out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. Immediately the leprosy left him, and he charged him to tell no one, but go and show yourself to the priest, and make an offering for your cleansing, as a testimony to them. just as Moses commanded. However, the report went around concerning him all the more, and great multitudes came together to hear and to be healed by him of their infirmities. So he himself often withdrew into the wilderness and prayed. Now it happened on a certain day, as he was teaching, that there were Pharisees and teachers of the law sitting by, who had come out of every town of Galilee, Judea, and Jerusalem. And the power of the Lord was present to heal them. Then behold, men brought on a bed a man who was paralyzed, whom they sought to bring in and lay before him. And when they could not find how they might bring him in, because of the crowd, they went up on the housetop and let him down with his bed through the tiling into the midst before Jesus. When he saw their faith, he said to him, Man, your sins are forgiven you. And the scribes and the Pharisees began to reason, saying, Who is this who speaks blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God alone? But when Jesus perceived their thoughts, he answered and said to them, Why are you reasoning in your hearts? Which is easier to say, Your sins are forgiven you, or to say, Rise up and walk? But that you may know that the Son of Man has power on earth to forgive sins. He said to the man who was paralyzed, I say to you, arise, take up your bed, and go to your house. Immediately he rose up before them, took up what he had been lying on, and departed to his own house, glorifying God. And they were all amazed, and they glorified God and were filled with fear, saying, We have seen strange things today. After these things he went out and saw a tax collector named Levi, sitting at the tax office. And he said to him, Follow me. So he left all, rose up, and followed him. Then Levi gave him a great feast in his own house, and there were a great number of tax collectors and others who sat down with them. And their scribes and the Pharisees complained against his disciples, saying, Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners? Jesus answered and said to them, Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. Then they said to him, Why do the disciples of John fast often, and make prayers, and likewise those of the Pharisees, but yours eat and drink? And he said to them, Can you make the friends of the bridegroom fast while the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, then they will fast in those days. Then he spoke a parable to them. No one puts a piece from a new garment on an old one, otherwise the new makes a tear. And also the piece that was taken out of the new does not match the old. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, or else the new wine will burst the wineskins and be spilled, and the wineskins will be ruined. But new wine must be put into new wineskins, and both are preserved. And no one, having drunk old wine, immediately desires new, for he says, The old is better. Chapter 6. Now it happened on the second Sabbath after the first, that he went through the grain fields. And his disciples plucked the heads of grain and ate them, rubbing them in their hands. And some of the Pharisees said to them, Why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath? But Jesus answering them said, Have you not even read this, what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he went into the house of God, took and ate the showbread, and also gave some to those with him, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat. And he said to them, The Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. Now it happened on another Sabbath also that he entered the synagogue and taught, and a man was there whose right hand was withered. So the scribes and Pharisees watched him closely, whether he would heal on the Sabbath, that they might find an accusation against him. But he knew their thoughts, and said to the man who had the withered hand, Arise and stand here. And he arose and stood. Then Jesus said to them, I will ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy? And when he had looked around at them all, he said to the man, Stretch out your hand. And he did so. And his hand was restored as whole as the other. But they were filled with rage, and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. Now it came to pass in those days that he went out to the mountain to pray, and continued all night in prayer to God. And when it was day, he called his disciples to himself, and from them he chose 12, whom he also named apostles: Simon, whom he also named Peter, and Andrew his brother, James and John, Philip and Bartholomew, Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon called the Zealot, Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who also became a traitor. And he came down with them and stood on a level place with a crowd of his disciples, and a great multitude of people from all Judea and Jerusalem, and from the sea coast of Tyre and Sidon, who came to hear him and be healed of their diseases, as well as those who were tormented with unclean spirits, and they were healed. And the whole multitude sought to touch him, for power went out from him and healed them all. Then he lifted up his eyes toward his disciples and said, Blessed are you poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you shall be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you shall laugh. Blessed are you when men hate you, and when they exclude you, and revile you, and cast out your name as evil, for the Son of Man's sake. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for indeed your reward is great in heaven. For in like manner their fathers did to the prophets. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full, for you shall hunger. Woe to you who laugh now, for you shall mourn and weep. Woe to you when all men speak well of you, for so did their fathers to the false prophets. But I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, and pray for those who spitefully use you. To him who strikes you on the one cheek, offer the other also. And from him who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who asks of you, and from him who takes away your goods, do not ask them back. And just as you want men to do to you, you also do to them likewise. But if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And if you lend to those from whom you hope to receive back, what credit is that to you? For even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much back. But love your enemies, do good, and lend, hoping for nothing in return. And your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High. For he is kind to the unthankful and evil. Therefore be merciful, just as your Father also is merciful. Judge not, and you shall not be judged. Condemn not, and you shall not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be put into your bosom. For with the same measure that you use, it will be measured back to you. And he spoke a parable to them. Can the blind lead the blind? Will they not both fall into the ditch? A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone who is perfectly trained will be like his teacher. And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not perceive the plank in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, Brother, let me remove the speck that is in your eye, when you yourself do not see the plank that is in your own eye? Hypocrite! First remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck that is in your brother's eye. For a good tree does not bear bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit, for every tree is known by its own fruit. For men do not gather figs from thorns, nor do they gather grapes from a bramble bush. A good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good, and an evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart brings forth evil. For out of the abundance of the heart his mouth speaks. But why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do the things which I say? Whoever comes to me and hears my sayings and does them, I will show you whom he is like. He is like a man building a house, who dug deep and laid the foundation on the rock. And when the flood arose, the stream beat vehemently against that house, and could not shake it, for it was founded on the rock. But he who heard and did nothing is like a man who built a house on the earth without a foundation, against which the stream beat vehemently, and immediately it fell. And the ruin of that house was great. Well, tonight's been a wonderful stream. I'm always uplifted when I get to meet other Christians who come here and hear the teachings that I'm promoting. Tonight's from Chuck Missler is very important. Um, what truth is and how we view the world. is incredibly important, especially these days. Uh, People have asked what truth is again since Pilate asked it, and even before then. Pilate, who convicted Christ and commanded his execution, at one point said, the quote, "What is truth?" And he was speaking to truth itself, Jesus Christ. Um, and he couldn't see it when it was staring him in the face, but that is what it is. He's made his choices, and we have to make our own. And when we're presented with the truth that God has provided us through the Bible, we need to hear it, and we need to respond to it, and we need to follow what Jesus Christ teaches. I don't, do it perfectly, but through the Lord, praise Him, I get better and better every day. And I just pray that everybody who's listening believes in Jesus Christ, makes Him Lord over their own heart, their own will, and believes in their heart that He rose from the dead, because He did, and that's how we know that He will raise us from the dead at the last. I know that I will be with Him in heaven when I die, or if He comes back, Lord willing. And I hope that I hope that everybody listening joins me. So as we always do with our stream, I'm going to end with a prayer. So, Lord, you are the King of kings and the Lord of lords, and we praise you, for you are good and holy and just and righteous, but also you're merciful and understanding, and you love us and you care about us, and you loved us so much that you sent your Son to die on the cross for us, a horrible, humiliating death, one that we deserve, but you took the punishment for us, God, and we praise you and we thank you for that. God, I just pray that you continue to use these streams to reach those who you have for me to reach. I want to be a fisher of men, God, and I pray that you bless the work that I'm doing here. Lord, I just pray for all of those who are out there listening, specifically those who are looking for a church, God. I know that it's difficult to find a good church that follows your word and teaches your word exclusively. I just pray that all those who are seeking will find, and those who ask will receive, God. I just pray that you be with us through all the troubles and the trials and the tribulations that we go through. I've had a tough week, so I pray that you're with me and you're with everyone else who's going through some stuff as well. Lord, you provided a way for us to be saved through your Son, Jesus Christ, and the sacrifice he made on the cross. And because of that, he is our high priest, and that is why we pray in his name, Jesus Christ. Amen. Well, that is the end of the stream for tonight. Really happy for everybody that joined us tonight. I should be on tomorrow evening, probably around 7 or 8 o'clock, I hope. But yeah, so thank you all for joining. I hope you have a good night and get some good sleep. Goodbye.